August 6, 1945. 8:14 in the morning. The city of Hiroshima lay beneath a sky so clear it seemed painted by divine intention. In the harbor, 20 kilometers south, the Imperial Japanese Navy destroyer Hamikaze rocked gently against its moorings, its steel hull warm to the touch even in the early hour. Petty Officer Takeshi Yamamoto stood on the aft deck, a cigarette balanced between oil-stained fingers, watching the contrails of a single B-29 bomber trace a white scar across the perfect blue dome above. The air smelled of salt and diesel fuel, and the faint sweetness of the pine forests that ringed the inland sea. Other sailors emerged from below deck, shielding their eyes against the morning glare, pointing upward at the American aircraft as it carved a lazy turn toward the city. Someone laughed. Another man clapped. The B-29 was leaving. The engines, that familiar drone that had become the soundtrack of their sleepless nights, was fading to the north. No bombs had fallen, no incendiaries. Just reconnaissance, they thought. Just another American observer counting the ruins they would one day claim. Yamamoto flicked his cigarette into the water and turned back toward the hatch. That was when the sky split open. For 3 years and 8 months, the men of the Imperial Japanese Navy had told themselves a story. It was a story about destiny, about racial superiority, about the inevitability of their triumph over the soft, materialistic Americans who could not possibly possess the spiritual fortitude required for total war. They had been raised on this narrative from childhood, feted in schoolrooms where portraits of the emperor hung beside maps showing the Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere stretching from the Aleutians to Australia. The Americans, their teachers, insisted, were a mongrel race corrupted by democracy, weakened by individualism, incapable of the collective sacrifice that defined the Yamato spirit. When Pearl Harbor burned, when Singapore fell, when the Philippines crumbled, these beliefs seemed confirmed by history itself. The Western powers were paper tigers after all, their colonial empires rotting from within, their soldiers surrendering by the thousands rather than dying with honor. Japanese sailors had watched the British battleships Prince of Wales and Repulse slip beneath the waves off Malaya, had seen American defenders on Bataan stumble into captivity, hollow-eyed and beaten. This was proof, they believed, that the war would be short and glorious, that the Americans lacked the will to fight across the vast Pacific, that they would negotiate peace once they understood the futility of opposing Japanese destiny. But the war did not end in 6 months. It did not end in a year. And by the summer of 1945, in the harbors and anchorages where the surviving ships of the once mighty combined fleet lay hidden among the islands, the story Japanese sailors told themselves had begun to crack like porcelain under pressure. They still believed in ultimate victory because they had no other choice, because to doubt was to court treason and despair, because the alternative was unthinkable. Yet the evidence accumulating before their eyes told a different tale entirely. The Americans kept coming. Month after month, island after island, they came with a relentlessness that seemed inhuman in its precision. They came with fleets that darkened the horizon, with aircraft that filled the sky like migrating birds, with supplies that never seemed to diminish no matter how many ships Japan sent to the bottom. Japanese sailors had expected to face an enemy, weakened by luxury, slowed by democratic debate, hampered by racial disunity. Instead, they encountered an industrial colossus that appeared to grow stronger with each passing season, that replaced every loss twice over, that fought with a methodical efficiency that made mockery of spiritual warfare. The contrails had appeared over Japan itself in November 1944, B-29. Superfortresses flying at altitudes Japanese fighters could barely reach, bombing with an accuracy that made the sailors wonder if the Americans possessed some supernatural technology. These were not the flimsy bombers of the war's early years. These were machines that seemed to embody everything Japan lacked: size, power, abundance, the luxury of excess capacity. Each B-29 represented more aluminum and more man-hours than an entire squadron of Japanese aircraft. They flew missions of such distance that Japanese pilots, rationed to drops of fuel, could scarcely comprehend the logistics involved. And they kept coming, night after night, wave after wave, until the sailors stopped counting and simply listened to the air raid. Sirens wail their futile warnings into the darkness. When the incendiaries fell on Tokyo in March 1945, killing more people in a single night than any air raid in history, the sailors who saw the glow on the horizon from their ships understood that something fundamental had shifted. The Americans were no longer fighting to defeat Japan. They were fighting to erase it. Yamamoto had joined the Navy in 1940, a 17-year-old boy from a fishing village in Kyushu who believed every word of the recruitment posters promising glory and honor in service to the emperor. His father, too poor to afford anything but pride, had wept at the train station when Yamamoto departed for training. His mother had given him a senninbari, a 1,000-stitch belt made by women who believed the collective prayers woven into the fabric would shield their sons from enemy bullets. He wore it still, wrapped around his waist beneath his uniform, though he no longer believed in its power. 5 years of war had taught him that bullets and bombs did not discriminate between the faithful and the fearful. He had survived the Battle of the Philippine Sea, where American fighters had massacred Japanese aircraft in a slaughter the Americans called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. He had survived the Battle of Leyte Gulf, where the Navy's desperate gamble to destroy the American invasion fleet had ended in catastrophic failure. He had watched ships he served on burn and sink, had pulled dying men from oil-slicked water, had stood at attention as what remained of his shipmates received posthumous promotions they would never know about. By August 1945, Yamamoto no longer thought about victory or defeat. He thought about survival, about seeing his village again, about whether the rice paddies his family tended would still exist when the war finally ended. But beneath the exhaustion and the hunger and the gnawing fear that never quite disappeared, something else had taken root in Yamamoto and in thousands of sailors like him. A terrible, reluctant awe at what the Americans had accomplished. It was never spoken aloud, never acknowledged in the presence of officers, or in the letters censored before they left the ship. But it existed nonetheless, a quiet recognition that the story they had been told was a lie, that the Americans were not weak or decadent or spiritually inferior. They were something far more dangerous. They were competent, organized, and backed by resources that seemed bottomless. Japanese sailors had grown up in a nation where scarcity defined every aspect of life, where a family might save for years to afford a bicycle, where metal was so precious that households donated pots and pans to be melted down for weapons. The Americans fought a different kind of war entirely, one where abundance was the ultimate weapon. They threw away equipment that Japanese soldiers would have treasured. They fed their troops with a variety and quantity of food that seemed like fantasy. They painted their aircraft in bright markings because camouflage was unnecessary, when you controlled the skies so completely that the enemy could do nothing but watch you pass overhead. In the final months of the war, Japanese sailors developed a grim fascination with American supply drops that occasionally fell into their hands. The contents were cataloged and studied like archaeological artifacts from an alien civilization. Cigarettes packaged 20 to a pack, so plentiful that Americans could afford to smoke them carelessly. Chocolate bars wrapped in waxed paper, sweet and rich in a way Japanese children had never experienced. Canned rations containing meat and vegetables and desserts, 3,000 calories packaged for a single soldier, while Japanese troops survived on rice balls and seaweed. The sailors marveled at the waste implied by such abundance, at the casual disposal of materials Japan was fighting a war to secure. Some destroyer crews recovered rubber life rafts from downed American pilots and found them superior to anything the Japanese Navy produced, equipped with fishing kits and signal mirrors and rations sufficient for weeks at sea. The Americans, it seemed, valued the life of a single airman enough to invest more in his survival gear than Japan invested in an entire infantry platoon. This was not the behavior of a decadent nation on the verge of collapse. This was the behavior of an empire so secure in its strength that it could afford to care about individuals, could waste resources on the possibility that one man might be saved. The B-29 that appeared over Hiroshima that August morning was unusual only in its solitude. Normally, the Superfortresses came in formations, 100 or more aircraft filling the sky with thunder and terror. A single bomber suggested reconnaissance, perhaps photography of the damage previous raids had inflicted. The sailors on Hamakaze barely bothered to reach for their helmets. The ship's anti-aircraft guns remained silent, their crews having learned months ago that firing at aircraft flying at 10,000 meters was a waste of ammunition Japan could not spare. Yamamoto watched the contrail with the detached interest of a man who had seen the same sight dozens of times. Years later, after the occupation had ended and Japan had begun its long transformation into something simultaneously foreign and familiar, Yamamoto would work as a fisherman like his father before him, taking his boat into the inland sea where warships once anchored. The water remained the same, blue and calm on peaceful days, gray and turbulent when storms approached. But the sky had changed. He never looked up without remembering that August morning, without seeing in his mind's eye the contrails of a solitary B-29, without feeling again the flash that turned day into something brighter and more terrible than day had any right to be. He would tell his sons about the war, about the lessons purchased with millions of lives, and the central lesson was this: abundance is power, and power shapes the world regardless of faith or courage or righteousness. The Americans had possessed abundant land, abundant resources, abundant creativity, and they had transformed that abundance into weapons that rewrote the rules of human conflict. Japan had possessed courage and discipline and spiritual unity, and those qualities had proven insufficient against an enemy whose factories produced aircraft faster than Japan could shoot them down, whose fields grew food faster than Japan could starve them out, whose scientists unlocked secrets of nature faster than Japan could conceive of the questions. The mushroom cloud over Hiroshima had been beautiful in its way, terrible but undeniably impressive, a monument to human capacity for both creation and destruction. It had been proof that mankind had finally achieved the power to destroy itself, that the same ingenuity that built cities and cured diseases and sent machines into the sky could also unleash forces sufficient to end civilization. Some would call that power evil, but Yamamoto had learned to think of it as simply power, neither moral nor immoral, simply existing, simply capable of being wielded by whoever possessed the resources and knowledge to claim it. The Americans had possessed both, and they had used them, and the world that emerged from the ashes of Hiroshima and Nagasaki was a world where abundance of technology, of resources, of the freedom to pursue knowledge without constraint, determined outcomes more reliably than any other factor. The sailors who cheered when the B-29 turned away had expected another ordinary day in a war that had long since ceased to be glorious, had devolved into a matter of survival and endurance. What they received instead was a glimpse of the future, a demonstration that ordinary days were a luxury that could be revoked in an instant by forces beyond comprehension. The sky had returned brighter than the sun, and in that brightness, everything they believed about strength and weakness, victory and defeat, civilization and savagery had been incinerated as thoroughly as the city of Hiroshima itself. Yamamoto carried that knowledge for the rest of his life, a weight heavier than any senninbari belt, more enduring than any prayer. He had witnessed the moment when warfare transcended its previous limits, when human conflict achieved escape, velocity from the constraints of conventional destruction, and entered a realm where total annihilation became possible, even probable, given sufficient motivation and fear. The final truth was simpler and more profound than any propaganda. Freedom produced abundance. Abundance enabled innovation, and innovation, given time and resources, could achieve anything, including the power to split atoms and remake the sun on Earth. The Americans had not won because they were morally superior or spiritually stronger. They had won because their system, for all its flaws and contradictions, generated surplus. Surplus food, surplus steel, surplus creativity, surplus human potential, and they had channeled that surplus into victory. Japan had fought with everything it possessed, had sacrificed without reservation, had pushed its people to the absolute limits of endurance, and it had not been enough. It would never have been enough. The arithmetic had been settled before the first shot was fired, decided by factors that courage could not overcome and honor could not redeem. All that remained was for the lesson to be learned, written in fire across 2 cities, burned into the retinas of sailors who had cheered when the bomber turned away, not knowing that in turning away, it was leaving behind the weapon that would end their world and birth a new one, stranger and more dangerous than any that had come before. The sky over Hiroshima never entirely recovered its innocence. Decades later, survivors would still flinch at aircraft passing overhead, would still see in their dreams the flash that preceded the burning, would still carry in their bodies the cellular damage that caused cancers to bloom years after the event itself. The dead numbered more than 100,000 in Hiroshima alone, with equivalent tolls in Nagasaki, and their deaths purchased a lesson the world struggled to comprehend. That the same abundance that built hospitals and universities and art museums could also build arsenals sufficient to end human history. Yamamoto lived long enough to see Japan rebuild, to see democracy take root in soil fertilized by defeat, to see prosperity return on a scale that dwarfed the pre-war empire. He lived long enough to understand that the atomic bomb had not just ended a war but had fundamentally altered the nature of human existence, had created a permanent shadow from which civilization could never fully emerge. And on clear mornings when the sky was blue and cloudless and the sun rose bright over the inland sea, he would remember standing on the deck of Hamakaze, watching the contrails fade to the north, feeling relief that another raid had been avoided. He would remember the moment before the flash, the last moment when the old world still existed, before the sky returned brighter than the sun and everything changed forever. That memory remained vivid until the end of his days, sharp and clear and inescapable, a testimony that some things, once witnessed, could never be forgotten, could never be reconciled, could only be carried forward as evidence of what mankind had become and what it might yet destroy in its abundance of power and its poverty of wisdom.